Welcome to the Week 5 lecture on Chapter 7, Food and Agriculture. This week we're going to be looking at how many people are chronically hungry and why hunger persists around the world when there are lots of surpluses in other areas of the world. What are some of the health risks of undernourishment, poor diet, and also from overeating? What are our primary food crops? Describe 5 components of soil. What was the Green Revolution? What are GMOs and what traits are most commonly introduced with GMOs? And describe some of the environmental costs of farming and ways we can minimize these costs. Here's a quote by Albert Einstein that we can't solve problems by using the same thinking we used when we created them. So I think we tend to try to look at things in the same way, and this is just saying that sometimes we need to have some fresh ideas to solve the problems and not keep doing things the way that we have always done them. Here's a case study of farming the Cerrado, and this was an area that was previously grasslands and tropical forest, and they didn't think that it was suitable for farming. Now it's starting to have a boom of soybean farming in this area, and this area is extremely biodiverse and rich with lots of different types of life, and they are starting to come through this area and take away all the natural vegetation that's there and the natural ecosystems and put farms into this area, and it's having a big impact on the area and changing the way that this area is. Let's first look here at some global trends in food and nutrition. Food production has been transformed. It used to be small-scale, diversified operations, and now they're vast operations of thousands of hectares, growing 1 or 2 genetically modified crops with abundant inputs of fuel and fertilizer for a competitive global market. And despite these changes, food costs have actually risen recently, and in general, global food supply problems have more to do with distribution than they do with supply. So it's especially food can spoil, so it's getting the food to where it needs to go. And it's not so much of do we have enough food, but can we get to the people who need the food? And we continue to produce surpluses, but hunger remains an urgent problem. Food security is unevenly distributed. 50 years ago, hunger was one of the world's most persistent problems. Today, conditions have changed dramatically, but others have changed very little. The world's population's more than doubled, but food production has risen even faster. So we've actually we've been able to increase food production at a faster rate than people are growing. So you would think that there should be enough food to continue to go around to everyone, even as the population grows. But that's not really the problem. The problem is getting that food to the people who need it. So population growth has been 1.7% per year. Food production increase has been 2.2% per year. So a bit larger, but still the food isn't getting to the people who need it. Changes in dietary, energy, and protein consumption. So if you look at these charts going from 1960 to 2010, it shows these different regions, shows the world in general on the black line, and then all these different regions and the different colored lines, and how many calories that people are consuming per day. And so as you can see, in most all of these areas, for the most part, the calories people are consuming per day has gone up quite a bit since 1960. Even though calories that people are consuming in different areas has gone up, hunger has definitely not been eliminated. So food production has gone up for what it used to be. Calories are being increased around the world, but still there are a lot of people around the world who are hungry. So green areas have the lowest hunger level, but I'm sure you know, even in our own country, that there are still lots of food problems, still lots of people that, you know, it's less than 5% that do face hunger issues, and but certainly not to the extent that they do in a lot of the other parts of the world, especially in the African region, where there's a lot of that continent that has over 35% of the people chronically hungry. This chart shows changes in number and rate of malnourishment across the world. And if you look at all of these different areas, the world in general, and all these different countries, for the most part, hunger or malnourishment, people who are not getting the appropriate food to meet their needs, has gone down in all of these regions. pretty much gone down significantly in all of these regions, but there still is a problem worldwide with hunger. It's not gone, but it has gone down. Food security is a term that we use to describe the ability of someone or of a group to obtain healthy food and enough healthy food each day to meet their needs, to be healthy and to live. And it has to deal with the economics of the area, environmental issues in the area, being able to produce the food, and social conditions, so being able to get the food and have access to the food, and food at the cost that people can afford. Even in wealthy countries such as the United States, millions lack a sufficient healthy diet. So we have a lot of times a large quantity of food, but we're not always eating the best quality food. And so in the United States, that tends to be the problem, that we're not, either don't have access to healthy food or just don't make the choices to eat healthy food. Whereas in a lot of other countries, their issue may be getting the actual food that they need to get the calories they need. Especially if regions that already have weaker economies and food problems, those areas having a drought or a flood or insect outbreak can really impact people's ability to get the food that they need. At least 6 million children under 5 years old die every year of diseases exacerbated by hunger and malnutrition. So a good percentage of kids and people in general are having health problems due to malnutrition. Famines usually have political and social roots, and globally, widespread hunger arises when there's political instability, things like war, conflict. These displace people, so people have to move from their normal area, from their normal food sources, whether it's a farm or villages where they get their food, or it might be too dangerous to go out and do their normal farming. So hunger is not always just going to the store and can you get the food or can you afford the food, but also there can be some social things going on that create hunger problems. Famine is a large-scale food shortage with widespread starvation, social disruption, and economic chaos. And even when better conditions return, it often takes a long time to recover because people may have consumed their seed grain and breeding livestock. So they might have had seed set aside to grow for the next year and some livestock that they normally would breed. And if they eat up their seeds, because they need that grain because they're hungry and their life depends on it at the moment, and they don't have any seeds to plant for the next year, they don't have any livestock to rebreed, and so sometimes they get rid of their that future source of food to meet their immediate needs. Here's a picture of hungry children in Somalia, and we'll take a look at the next slide here on some different types of problems that hunger and nutrient deficiencies can cause. So a good diet is essential to keep you healthy. You need the right nutrients and enough calories for a productive and energetic lifestyle. So your body has the ability to break down the food you eat and make certain amino acids that are needed to build proteins. And some of these you can make for yourself, but certain amino acids and proteins you have to consume from other things to get the right nutrients that you need in order for your body to function. And about 3 billion people, almost half the world's population, suffers from some sort of vitamin, mineral, or protein deficiency. And if you hear the term vitamin, I think we all know, a lot of people take vitamins, but what a vitamin actually is vitamin stands for, if you look at the term vitamin, it stands for vital amino acid. And if you remember back from one of our previous lecture, amino acids are just the building blocks of protein. So it's just little pieces that make up a protein. And protein is the stuff that like your muscles are made out of. And so there's about 20 different amino acids, and you have to have all these amino acids in order for your body to function properly. And some of these amino acids we don't get from our diet, and we take these vitamins or vital amino acids to give us the amino acids that we're missing in our diet. And those amino acids are used to build the proteins that we need to live our lives. So here's a couple different types of diseases. So malnourishment just means it's a general term for nutritional imbalances caused by a lack of nutrients. And so it could be relating to any different nutrients that you're missing. Specifically, if you have a lack of protein in young children, you can get something called kwashiorkor or marasmus, which occurs when both protein and calories are lacking. And that's this. This is the marasmus, the kwashiorkor. Usually you see the big bloated abdomen, so they have a big stomach on the little kids who are really skinny otherwise, but they have the big bloated stomach. Another example of a nutritional deficiency is goiter. You can see that here, and that's from an iodine deficiency. So a lot of times you'll see your salt has iodine added into it. You don't need a whole lot of iodine, but you do need some iodine. And if you don't have any, you can get certain problems such as goiter. Here's a look at the food pyramid. This food pyramid probably has changed slightly since you were kids, depending on how old you are. I know it's changed since I was a kid. It will probably change throughout your lifetime again as they analyze what they think is the healthy variety to eat. But overall, I think as we all know, we should be eating a healthy variety of plants and meats and grains to give us our calories and vitamins, and try to go sparingly on the sugars and lots of fats. And so there's a lot of different diets and ways that you can do this. But I think overall, you want to be trying to eat a healthy variety of food and limiting your food, your processed food, your sugary drinks. And so this is an important thing to try to teach to kids in societies, is how to eat healthy, because a lot of kids, especially as time has gone on, we have a lot more prepackaged and processed foods. A lot of kids don't really tend to look at what they're eating. And with this tendency, especially in our country, we have a tendency towards obesity because we're getting a large amount of high calorie, either high fat or high sugar foods that don't really make you full and don't give you those vital amino acids or vitamins that you need to be healthy. So as I was just talking about overeating, it's not just a problem in the US, it's a growing problem worldwide. So as a lot of countries go to becoming richer, they tend to get more overweight people than underweight people. And it's not only limited to rich countries, though. There's a lot of things such as heart attack, stroke, and diabetes that were once only in the wealthier nations who were eating more of these more processed, high calorie, low nutrition foods. But now they're becoming prevalent in a lot of different areas across the world. So in the US, Europe, China, and even other developing countries, all these highly processed foods have become a large part of their diet. And some 64% of adult Americans are overweight, and this was up from only 40% a decade ago. About a third of people in the US are seriously overweight or obese, and more than 20% over their ideal weight for their person's height and sex. So, one thing I would encourage you all to do as you go about your daily lives is look at what you actually eat. Look at the ingredients list in your food, and think about what you're actually putting into your body. And we all have certain foods that we eat, but it is interesting to look at the ingredients and look at the various chemicals in your food and preservatives and other things that are in your food, and look at if what you eat on a day-to-day basis, do you think that is actually a healthy diet or not? Here's a chart showing chronic obesity in some different countries, and the blue here is the amount in 1960, and the purple is the percentage of overweight people in 2010, and the red is the percentage of underweight people in 2010. So in the United States, blue here being this is where our overweight people were in 1960. This is where we're up to in 2010. You can see the UK has had a significant increase in overweight people, and a lot of places have had a significant increase in overweight people. So pretty much all countries have had an increase in overweight people, and then underweight people is, in most of these major countries is fairly small. You get to Japan, China, and India has quite a large population of underweight people. Now, it's logical to think that if we have hunger in the world, that any area that's producing food, if they increase production, that means that hunger worldwide should go down. And that seems very logical, but really we've seen that having more production hasn't been getting rid of hunger or necessarily always reducing hunger. And the overabundance of food supplies in much of the world suggests that global hunger, solving that may lie in better use and distribution of food resources, not just being able to increase the food in a certain area. Even in developing areas, a lack of food production is not always the cause of hunger. And global food waste amounts to about 30% of all food production and 1.3 billion tons annually as food is spoiled in storage, transit, used inefficiently, or thrown away after preparation. So if you think in your own daily lives how much food you buy at the store that goes rotten in your fridge, or that you eat and make dinner and you have leftovers that get spoiled in your fridge after you've made them. And so I think all of us probably, unless you're really, really conscious of this, probably have some food waste in your own houses, but then there's probably also food waste at the store. So that's a huge amount of food that's being produced. If 1/3 of all the food that gets produced is lost, no one's eating it. So as we look at food crops traditionally were used for a food source for people. As biofuels have come into the market, that's changed a lot of the way crops are grown and what crops are grown for and where they're grown, because now there's suddenly a big market for things like soy, corn, palm oil, and sugarcane that are used to make these biofuels, or fuels made from plants rather than from oil products. And U.S. federal ethanol subsidies led to a doubling of corn prices in 2007. And there's definitely positives with having the biofuels, and that we're not burning using up our fossil fuel resources. But in developing countries, the production of these crops and other products, they're making them for export, and that often displaces the food production for actual food for people. And in areas with already with food problems, it can be increasing the food costs for the poor. So with anything, sometimes we create a solution to have some positive solution in one aspect, but it can have negative aspects in other areas, that sometimes these things are hard to foresee when we're coming up with all these ideas that we come up with. As I mentioned, when we look at world hunger and we realize that there are people hungry, the tendency is to try to increase food production in those really anywhere to get food to these people. But when you look at if we have enough farmland, or if we should be clearing more land to make farmland, we really do at this point have enough farmland to feed more than the amount of people that live on Earth, especially if you look at that we have 30% waste of our food. So when you look at whether we should expand production by clearing new land for farmland, in a lot of places this probably isn't the best idea, because a lot of the world's land that isn't cultivated and could potentially be converted into cropland is land that is valuable for a lot of other reasons. So, such as rainforest that has a huge amount of biodiversity and lots of plants that are helping to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and give oxygen to our atmosphere and keep our global climates cooler. There are a lot of benefits that this land has other than just providing food, but the big issue does still become, how do we get the food that's made to the people who need it? Here's a look at the food currently that we do eat, and the amount of different types of food that we ate in 1990 versus 2010. And there's just a few different plants and animals that provide most of our food. In the US, corn and soybeans have become primary staple foods, and wheat and rice are also very important to a lot of countries. And if you look at most of these grains and meat and milk, they have gone up from 1990 to 2010 of how many metric tons of this food that we are consuming. And probably part of that increase in consumption is just that population has increased. So you can see the main things that are being eaten in globally are coarse grains such as barley, oats, sorghum, rye, and millet, and vegetables, corn, rice, wheat, sweet potatoes, soybeans, palm oil fruit or oil from palm fruit, oil from other crops, things like beans and peas, meat, milk, fish, and seafood. So those make up the majority of food for the majority of the world. Let's take a look at some of these major food crops such as corn, soy, and wheat in the U.S. And you can see that corn production has gone up pretty steadily over since 1960 to 2010, and soy and wheat have gone up a little bit, gone up steadily, but not to the same extent that corn's gone up. Rising meat production is actually a sign of wealth, and so there's a dramatic increase in corn and soy production because these grains are given, or the corn and soy are given to livestock to eat to basically help produce the meat that we want to eat. So meat is a concentrated, high-value source of protein. It has iron, fats, and other nutrients that give us a lot of energy. And meat production has doubled in the past 45 years, but meat is a good indicator of wealth because it's expensive to produce in terms of the resources needed. So as we'll talk about later, it takes a lot of pounds of grain to produce a pound of meat. So if you were limited on resources and you're limited on money and space, you can get a lot more calories out of directly eating the grain versus having to take, for example, 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. Meat and dairy consumption has actually quadrupled in the last 40 years, and quadrupled in not only just our own country, but starting more and more in other countries. So here's a look at the number of kilograms, and this is in kilograms, not pounds, but kilograms of grain required to produce different foods. So it takes 8 kilograms of grain to produce 1 pound of beef, and 3 kilograms of grain to produce 1 pound of pork, 2 kilograms of grain to produce a pound of chicken, and then 1.5 kilograms of grain to produce a pound of fish, and 1-to-1 ratio for grain to produce grain. So if you were limited in the amount of food that you could grow in an area, the best amount, if you want to get the most food out of your crop, then just by eating the grains directly is going to give you that most food. It takes a lot of grains to produce meat. A number of technological and breeding innovations have made increased production possible, so we're able to get more and more pounds of beef or chicken or whatever you're looking at, whatever type of meat, out of a certain amount of grain compared to what we used to. So you used to have to feed for a longer period of time and a lot more grain. We are working to get those numbers down, and I think there's some controversy on whether the methods that we're using to get these numbers down are actually healthy or not. But the main goal is, it is a good goal to basically use less pounds of grain and to more quickly get more pounds of meat. Sounds good, but we'll look a little bit about how that works here in just a second. But animals are housed and fed mainly soy and corn for rapid growth. So they're put, for example, cattle may be raised in lots of different types of settings, but then at the end they're sent to a feedlot and fed these little bit more filling grains that can put meat on them more quickly. And these operations dominate livestock raising in the US, Europe, and increasingly in China and other countries. And animals are housed in these giant enclosures with thousands of other animals. Here's a picture here of a large-scale chicken farm in the U.S. And with these large-scale intensive facilities, there can be up to 1 million animals per facility, and the animals are very densely packed in, which with any living thing, if you think of a disease being passed around, the closer these animals are confined and sharing resources, and they also share all their germs. And so there tends to be a very high use of antibiotics in these animals, and oftentimes being given just as a regular dosage in their feed to try to help keep infection and other diseases away. We'll talk a little bit about, coming up in the slides, why this antibiotic use in animals or in people is bad. And the other problem that comes from these large scale facilities is what to do with all of the water and air pollution from all the waste from these animals. So on a smaller scale farm, you tend to have a certain amount of waste coming off from any animal, even from yourself, that can sort of dissipate into the surroundings and the environment. But when you have this huge large scale group of animals, you have a large amount of waste that has to be dealt with and somehow disposed of. And so there can be some environmental implications if this waste is not dealt with properly, and it's allowed to just filter off, say, into the streams or lakes in a local area. This huge influx of, really, if you think urine and feces have a lot of certain nutrients like nitrogen, that can cause blooms of like algae and can have a lot of implications on the surrounding ecosystem. So as I mentioned, these intensive large-scale facilities can have a lot of waste coming off of them. And one of the problems, other than the nutrients getting out into the surrounding ecosystem, is that bacteria from these wastes can also get out into the surrounding environments. And the other main problems, which I mentioned, is that there's this constant use of antibiotics in the feed for these animals to help cut down on diseases. Since they're in such close quarters, this can be leading to antibiotic resistance diseases, which we'll cover why that's important on the next few slides here. So let's look at here why we should care about antibiotics. And this is bigger than even just for animals. This is also antibiotics for humans. And we hear a lot about antibiotic resistance. And let's talk about what that is first, so we all understand that. And then how the food industry plays a role in that. So usually antibiotics are effective at killing certain types of bacteria. So the word antibiotic just means anti or against biotics or living things. So it's something that kills living things, specifically bacteria. And when you take an antibiotic, let's say you have something like strep throat, and you take an antibiotic, typically that antibiotic will kill most of those bacteria that are in your body. And then there's sometimes a few left that your own immune system can just help to kill. But occasionally what happens is you have your original population of, let's say, your streptococcus bacteria that causes a strep throat. And you start taking the antibiotics, and one of these bacteria randomly gets a mutation, and this happens all the time, that suddenly that bacteria has something about it that it does not get killed by the antibiotic. So as you're taking the antibiotics, you have all these bacteria that are going to start slowly being killed off by the antibiotic. So this one bacteria that mutated isn't going to get killed. You might think, no big deal, one bacteria, because all these other bad ones are getting killed. So only that one that's resistant to the antibiotic, let's say you're taking amoxicillin, and this bacteria develops something where amoxicillin is not going to kill it anymore. So that one bacteria cell that mutates survives, and then it begins to replicate. So when you pass on your strep throat to the next person, all that they're getting is that resistant bacteria. So when they get strep throat, they've got an entire body filled with this resistant bacteria, or this bacteria that's not going to be killed by amoxicillin. So when you pass on your strep throat to your brother or your mother or your husband, when they get it and they try to take amoxicillin, it's not going to work. So our typical response is, you go into the doctor, you say it didn't work, I'm not getting better, and they give you a different antibiotic. So the problem is here, though, that the more the antibiotics are used, the more opportunity there is for them to mutate and become resistant. And although there are lots of new antibiotics created, and your brother or mother or husband can go into the doctor and get a different antibiotic, there's a huge increase in resistance to antibiotics that is increasing rapidly over time. So antibiotics are really amazing things, and they've allowed us to deal with a lot of diseases that used to be deadly, and now we don't think of them as really so bad at all. We really take it for granted that these antibiotics will work. And if antibiotic resistance were to continue faster than we can create new antibiotics, then these common problems like strep throat or an infected wound could become deadly as they were a century ago. And so if we ran out of antibiotics, if all these bacteria become resistant to all the antibiotics we have, then when you go in with that strep throat, there may be nothing that works for it. So here's a look at how the antibiotic resistance can spread. So let's say that this is you here, and you have some kind of disease and take antibiotics, and some of those bacteria become resistant, and so you now have whatever, let's say your strep throat, and you go into the hospital to get treatment for it, and you can spread then that resistant bacteria that does not get treated by the amoxicillin. You can spread it to everyone else in the hospital while you're there. So your nurse doesn't wash their hands good enough, or some of your bacteria are, and I shouldn't pick on nurses there, but those germs are everywhere. They're all over the nurses, they're all over the doctors, they're all over the bedding, and hospitals just have a lot of germs. So any healthcare worker in the hospital could pass on that germ that's now resistant. You also, let's say before you went to the hospital, you go out and about, you go to the store, and you pass your germs all around there. You go out to eat. And so this resistant bacteria is getting passed to lots of different people in the community. The other way that it can get passed that's important to look at is that these animals are we talk about taking antibiotics, should you take it when you get sick or not, but we tend to be giving in some of these large scale facilities antibiotics to animals all in their food all the time. And so that's a lot of organisms taking a lot of antibiotics in a huge area where antibiotic resistance can develop. And the way that this gets passed to humans is these organisms can get this bacteria that is resistant, and then when you eat that meat, let's say you go to eat your steak medium rare, and the inside of that steak has some kind of bacteria in it that's resistant, you eat that, and then you now have that those bacteria that are antibiotic resistant have spread to you. So there's a lot of different ways that antibiotic resistance can spread. Overtaking antibiotics definitely is not a good thing. And also, I think we can see the reasons why having antibiotics in your meat that you eat and in the food source can also pose a significant problem to our use of antibiotics in the future and to the development of antibiotic resistance. So we talked a lot about bacteria being bad, but really, most bacteria are not bad at all. In fact, most bacteria are essential to all the different things that your body does, and probably in much more ways than we even have any idea about at this point. So you have about 100 trillion bacteria in your body, which you only have about 10 trillion cells of your own human cells in your body. So you have 10 times more bacterial cells in your body than you have of your own bodily cells. If you were to be able to put all of these bacteria together, they would weigh about 5 pounds and be about the size of your liver. And most of these bacteria are very good, and they're essential for things like digestion and immunity and breaking down. For example, from the very moment you put food in your mouth, these bacteria help break down your food into sugar that you use as energy. And as I said, they help with your immune system, they help with digestion, and they help with a lot of other things. So just one example here, there's a type of bacteria called Clostridium, and it produces neuroprotective antioxidants. So we've all heard about antioxidants, but this bacteria produces these antioxidants, or things that help protect your brain cells. And they help protect your brain and nervous system. And this is currently being studied for treatment of Alzheimer's. And this is something that this bacteria naturally produces in your body, helping to protect your brain cells from breaking down. And bacteria can also produce their own version of like antibiotics, but this is natural. So it's something just produced naturally in your body, helping to kill other bad bacteria. Because really the good bacteria, they want to stay in your body and have a healthy place to live. They don't want you to be overtaken by bad bacteria and die, because that would mean that they would die. So you've developed this incredible mutualistic relationship with these hundreds of trillions of bacteria in your body that are really important for everything that your body does. And as I said, we probably have no idea all the different things that bacteria are doing in your body to help you out. And one problem with antibiotics is that when you take antibiotics, it kills indiscriminately. So it does not just kill the bad bacteria, it kills any of the good bacteria that you have in, not all of them, but it kills a good percentage of your good bacteria as well. So that's another reason why, if you don't need to take antibiotics, you don't want to if you don't have to. Although we certainly all have times when we do need them, and we are glad that they have them for us. So next year we're going to look at seafood, and so moving on from our land meats and grains to sort of more of our ocean source of protein. And seafood provides about 15% of all animal protein eaten by humans, and it's the main animal protein source for about 1 billion people in developing countries. And protein is an important thing. It's loaded with, as I said, all these amino acids that your body needs to do everything that it does. And recently, 13 of the 17 major fisheries around the world have declined. And by fisheries, we mean areas in the ocean where people go out and fish and get lots of food for these populations. So 13 of the 17 major regions where people get fish have declined dramatically or become commercially unsustainable. And aquaculture is providing a sort of alternative areas where you can produce this fish in ponds, and takes relatively little space but get a lot of fish out of that area, and hopefully take the pressure off of the natural fisheries and allow them to again increase. Although just like with farming on land, when you farm in a pond, you also have the worry of what you're putting into that pond getting out into the surrounding area. So if you're putting certain nutrients or food in, that getting out, and all the waste from the fish getting out into the surrounding area. So there are some things to look out for, but then there are some benefits of this as well. Here's an example of what the aquaculture can look like. And here's some fish pens in Thailand. And as I mentioned, 13 of the 17 world fisheries are declining, and so there's this pressure to need to produce more fish. But with that, we talked about the mangroves earlier in the course, and how important those are to the fisheries and to these ecosystems, the amazing amount of things that these mangroves do. And so tons of this mangrove area and other wetlands that are really important ecosystems have been removed in order to allow these fish ponds to go in. So not only are you removing some of these important ecosystems, but they are also, these release the feces. If the fish are given antibiotics, they release all these antibiotics and other pollutants out into the surrounding ocean waters, and then put that strain onto the surrounding fisheries as well. So you may not be taking from the fisheries, but some of the impacts from these ponds can spread to a much larger area than just where the ponds are located. Next year, we're going to move on from our food to the soil, which is another extremely important part of not only agriculture, but really of all living systems, because from the soil come the plants that feed, that form the base of the food chain for all other living things. And soil is a really marvelous substance. We probably don't think much about it. It is not just some dead dirt that's broken down rocks. It is filled with the broken down rocks and other living things. So it has all the minerals from weathered rocks, partially decomposed organic molecules or living things, and it's filled with lots of small living insects and worms and bacteria. And soil is like an ecosystem all by itself, so there's a lot going on within every little bit of soil that you see. Building just a few millimeters of soil can take anything from a few years to 1,000 years, depending on the ecosystem that you live in. So what has to happen to build soil is first here, if you look at the picture on the left, the rock gets broken down into smaller and smaller particles that eventually will get mixed with some organic matter or broken down plants and animal bodies. And then as time goes on, that soil, those rocks and those living things will mix together, get more and more mineral fragments and organic matter, and start developing these soil horizons where you have different amounts of particles and nutrients in these different horizons. And we won't get into all this in detail now, just because there's a lot to cover in this chapter. But this soil formation does take a long time. And if you use agricultural practices such as back in the days of the Dust Bowl, where you don't make sure that you protect your soil and you lose that soil, it can take a long time for you to get good soil back to an area again. And good soil is essential for plant growth in an area, whether it's for the plants that are just growing naturally in an ecosystem or for various crops. The good news is that if you take care of your soil, it's definitely a renewable resource. So it should, land should be able to be productive for a long time if you make sure that you do things such as crop rotation that ensure that various nutrients go into your soil, and that you don't use practices that encourage erosion and the washing away of this good soil that the land has created. So here's an example on the right of these terraced rice paddies, these Balinese rice paddies, and they help control erosion and make steep hillsides productive. So usually in agriculture, having a steep hillside is not great ecologically because or environmentally, because as you go to till the soil and plant the seeds and plow everything up, and then rain comes and wind, a lot of that soil can be blown away or washed away down the hill, and so it can be very damaging to that hillside and to the soil there. But certain areas have found ways that they're able to use these hillsides, such as by this terracing, and it helps prevent erosion and makes this area productive for agriculture and not environmentally damaging. Let's look here at what is soil. So soil is a mixture of 6 components. The first one is sand or gravel. So it's your rock in the area that's broken down into what they call larger particles. Although sand is still fairly small, it's larger than silt and clay, which we'll discuss in a second. So with sand and gravel, water will drain very quickly. So since there's not a huge amount of surface area compared to the particle size for sand and gravel, the surface area is what holds on to the water. So there's not a huge surface area in these large particles, and water will drain quickly through. In silt and clay, the surface area is much larger on these tiny particles, and it holds these little particles of silt and clay hold on to water, and so it drains more slowly. If you've ever poured water through like sand, you've probably seen it go through very quick, or through rocks, goes right through. If you have soil that has a lot of clay in it, the water will drain much more slowly. So that's the second thing that's in soil. The third thing is dead organic material, and this has a lot of nutrients in it. And organic material, contrary to thinking of the term organic for like your food, organic material we have down here at the bottom is anything that is living or was once living, such as decaying plant matter and decomposing bodies of worms, insects, rodents, and other animals. So it's just anything that was once living, and the soil, if it's dead now and mixed in with the soil, that is part of the soil. The soil also includes soil fauna and flora, fauna meaning plants and flora meaning animal life, or non-plant life, or sorry, fauna meaning animals and flora meaning plants. Sorry to confuse you there. So all the living things in the soil, such as the insects, worms, plant roots that are growing. Those are all part of the soil as well. Soil also usually needs to have some form of water, and this is necessary for plant growth. And plants can absorb that water through their roots, but you need to have some water in the soil. And soil also needs to have air, and this is necessary for important soil bacteria and other small animals. So all these living things, if they don't have any air and oxygen coming into the soil, would not be able to live there. Healthy soil fauna, or animals that are in the soil, can help make the soil very fertile and very good for growth for plants. So soil ecosystems include countless organisms that consume and decompose organic material, help aerate the soil, distribute nutrients through the soil. I'm sure we've all heard of things like having earthworms in your soil is good. They help eat all the plants that are around and release all those broken down nutrients in their feces and help break up that soil and create air pockets in that soil. So all the living things in the soil are also very important to having good, nutrient-rich, healthy soil. The best soil profile would be that you have on top the O layer, or decomposing leaves and organic material. You have topsoil, which is a little bit thicker, which is composed of a mix of the organic matter, roots, and inorganic matter. So it's a mix between your dead plants and animals up on top and your rock on the bottom. The E is the alluviated or washed out layer, where things, basically these nutrients from the top, are leaching down into the lower layers. And then you have your subsoil, which is has clays and other materials that have been leached from the upper layer. So this is holding some of your nutrients. This is where your nutrients are flowing through, and this is where you're creating these nutrients up here above. Your food comes mostly from the A horizon. So ideal farming soils have a thick, organic, rich A horizon. Lots of nutrients, good amount of oxygen, organic material in that layer. The soils that support the Corn Belt farm states of the U.S. Midwest have rich black A horizons that can be over 2 meters thick. However, a century of farming has washed much of the soil down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. Most soils have less than half a meter of the A horizon. Desert soils might have almost no O or A horizons. And so, as we've just mentioned on that last slide, soils can really vary dramatically based on the climate. So areas with a lot of plants growing and a lot of plant material above ground tend to have that plant material breaking up and going into the soil and have these thicker A or O layers with lots of organic material in them. A desert that does not have a lot of plants is not going to have a lot of plant material breaking up into the soil, and is going to tend to just be more of that soil without living things in it. Definitely not as productive for something like agriculture. Here's a map of cultivated cropland in the U.S. It's interesting to look at throughout the U.S. where what percentage of land in these areas is has a significant amount of cropland. And a lot of these regions that don't have a lot of cropland, a lot of the main reason is due to the amount of water in these areas. So a lot of these areas don't have the water necessary. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Like you look at a lot of Nevada, a lot of this is desert type land and not as suitable for farming practices. So let's look at some ways we use and abuse soil. So agriculture both causes and suffers from environmental degradation. So with improper agriculture practices, as we learned during the Dust Bowl, you can destroy that soil layer, and then future agriculture, even if you were trying to do things right, if you don't have a good soil layer to begin with, then it can suffer from that damage as well. Over the past 50 years, some 1,900 million hectares of agricultural land, an area greater than that now in production, have been degraded to some extent. Water and wind erosion cause a vast majority of global soil degradation, and chemical degradation is a second cause secondary cause of soil degradation includes nutrient depletion, salt accumulation, acidification, and pollution. So if you accumulate too many salts in your soil, if your soil becomes too acidic, these are all conditions that will not allow plants to grow as well there. Water is one of the leading causes of soil loss. So erosion is an important natural process that redistributes the products of global weathering. So normally water moves nutrients around, but sometimes this can move things around too much and move around the soil that we were counting on to grow crops in. Sheet erosion removes a thin layer of soil. Rill erosion occurs when small little rivulets or like tiny little rivers of running water cut small channels into the soil. Gully erosion is when you have a bigger ravine formed, washing away your soil. Stream bank erosion is also a problem in farmlands and streams where soil washes away from the stream banks. Here's a picture of showing the sheet erosion versus gully erosion for you to get a visual of what that looks like. So wind is a close second in erosion problems. Wind can create equal or can even exceed the water damage in erosive forests, and especially the case in dry regions where vegetation is sparse, that wind can cause a lot of erosion problems. When plant cover and surface litter are removed from the land by agriculture or grazing, wind lifts loose soil particles and sweeps them away. So, like for example, we used to live down by McDowell on the California side, just below the border, and they have a lot of the strawberry farms down there, and they every fall would pull up all those strawberry plants, and then a lot of the rest of the year they'd till up that land and it would just be bare and dust, and you drive through there and there is just the wind blowing dust everywhere. Can be a lot of dust storms in that area, and so you can see that wind causing that erosion, that wind causing that soil to blow away quite extensively down there. So intensive farming practices are largely responsible for this situation. So normally there's some plant cover on the ground, and that helps all those roots hold that soil in place. And when you remove all those roots from farming, and I'm really not trying to put farming down, although it probably sounds like it here. We definitely rely on farming and need farming for our food source, but there's definitely a lot of farming practices that we do need to look at their impacts, because they do impact the land in different ways, and it's important to understand these impacts so that as we do things like farm and manage land in other ways, we understand the positives and negatives and how to lessen the negative impacts. And I think we've definitely learned that over time, how to try to do things better so that we don't have such a negative impact on our soil, and that we continue to have this resource for future farming and for future other needs. So in extreme conditions, wind-blown dunes can encroach on useful land and cover roads and buildings. So like China has lost 93,000 kilometer squares, about the size of Indiana, to desertification. So basically the land becoming like a desert as these sand dunes from the Gobi Desert are moving closer and closer, and that sand blows in. Here's an example of wind erosion. So you can see that sand blowing up and starting to cover up these plants here. Soil is the foundation of food production, but there are many other really important critical factors to food production. So the soil is not the only thing. You also obviously, as we know all too well here, need reliable water resources. You also need the right nutrients to go into making healthy plants. You need favorable temperatures and rainfall. You need productive crop varieties and the mechanical energy to tend and harvest the crops. High yields usually require irrigation. So if you want to get a high yield, typically you need some form of irrigation, and agriculture uses at least 2/3 of all fresh water withdrawn from rivers, lakes, and groundwater. And there's a large variety in the estimates, but they estimate that somewhere around 15% of all cropland worldwide is irrigated. and how efficient this irrigation is can also vary greatly. So poor farmers may over-irrigate because they lack the technology to meter the water and distribute just the right amount that's needed. Wealthier countries, farmers can probably afford water-saving methods such as drip irrigation, which only waters the base of the crop and reduces evaporative losses. Pivot irrigation is mainly used in wealthier countries. So you may have most likely have seen that around you somewhere. The downside of irrigation is that excessive irrigation not only wastes water, but also results in waterlogging, which is when the soil has too much water and the plant roots will die from lack of oxygen. So if you've ever had a houseplant die because you watered it too much, this is an example of waterlogging. And also from salinization, which causes mineral salts to accumulate in the soil. So if you overwater, you can get salts to accumulate in the water when that water dissolves and the salts stay in the soil. So the water evaporates, and all salt has a little bit of, or all water has a little bit of salt in it, and those salts get left behind. And most of that salt is not good for most plants in too large of quantities. Fertilizer can boost production. So we probably all know that fertilizers can be applied to plants to give plants the nutrients that they need. And in large-scale farming, fertilizers are used to imply a sufficient supply of these nutrients. The major elements that are required by most plants are nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And much of the doubling in worldwide crop production since 1950 has come from increased use of inorganic fertilizer use, or inorganic meaning not from living things. Over-fertilizing is also a problem. So growing plants can only use a limited amount of nutrients. And if these nutrients are not captured, they can seep off into the groundwater and into other surrounding ponds, lakes, or streams. And they can contaminate drinking water and also get into aquatic ecosystems and cause things like algal blooms, or if you've ever seen a real green looking pond, which then those algal blooms can decrease your fish and have other problems to the ecosystem. Nitrate levels in groundwater have risen to dangerous levels in many areas where intensive farming is practiced. And then these increased nitrate levels can be also not healthy for humans drinking this water. So modern agriculture runs on oil, and the food system in the United States consumes about 16% of the total energy that we use. Our foods require more energy to produce, process, and get to market than they yield when we eat them. So each hectare of corn produced in the U.S. consumes the equivalent of 800 liters or 5 barrels of oil. And 1/3 of this energy is used in producing nitrogen fertilizers from natural gas. 1/3 is used for machinery and fuel, and 1/3 is used for irrigation, synthetic herbicides, and other fertilizers. Pesticide use is continuing to rise over time. Biological pests reduce crop yields and spoil as much as a half of the crops that are harvested every year in some areas. And modern agriculture largely depends on chemicals to kill or drive away these pests. And our resilience to them has grown, reliance to them has grown steadily over the years. So we've really relied on using chemicals to kill these pests that are eating the crops. Indiscriminate pesticide use, or just spraying over an entire field and killing whatever that pesticide will kill, also can create problems such as killing non-target species, so killing things that you don't want to kill, or creating new pests of organisms that were previously not a problem, or causing widespread pesticide resistance among pest species. So just like bacteria can become antibiotic resistant when you overuse a pesticide, organisms can become pesticide resistant. Value of global trade in pesticides is shown here on the chart below. And so as you look at over time, going from 1960 to 2010, there is a huge market for pesticides worldwide. And there you can see a picture of a plane spraying crops. And as you look at the number of the market for pesticides increasing, the number of pesticide-resistant species from 1960 is also increasing quite rapidly. So certain strains of plants or animals that are now resistant to the pesticides that we currently use. Let's look at, lastly here, how have we managed to feed billions? So in developing countries, 95% of agricultural growth in the 20th century came from improved crop varieties called the Green Revolution. So with these improved crop varieties, if you think of these crops, they're producing more like larger fruits, or corn that grows more corn and larger corn for each corn plant. These increases have also come from increased fertilization, irrigation, pesticide use, rather than from bringing new land in production. So in fact, less land is being cultivated now than 100 years ago in North America or 600 years ago in Europe. So if you hear about the Green Revolution, although that could mean, we tend to think of Green Revolution as and things other than just this, but the Green Revolution here in this context is just these improved crop varieties that produce a greater yield of the food that we want per plant. The Green Revolution is increased yield. So most of this gain is accomplished by the use of synthetic fertilizers along with conventional plant breeding. So through breeding different plants, you can get the plants with the characteristics that you look for. So if you look at natural selection, this would be an example of artificial selection. So we as humans are deciding what genes we want to be passed on. And let's say we're growing an apple tree. Well, we keep picking the largest apples from every tree, and assuming we want to select for large apples. And with every generation, we pick the biggest apples. And over time, you create this seed that's going to create these apple trees with these nice big apples that we want. So this is called artificial selection, when humans are the ones doing the selecting. And starting about 50 years ago, agricultural research stations began to breed tropical wheat and rice varieties that would provide food for growing populations in developing countries.